I was in active labor, gasping for air on my own living room floor, when my husband stepped over the puddle of my amniotic fluid to check his Rolex. He was not checking the time to time my contractions. He was checking to see if he would miss the traffic to the airport. His childhood best friend was standing by the door, touching up her lip gloss while I screamed in agony. I begged him to stay. I pleaded with him that the baby was coming right now. He just dropped a crumpled $20 bill on the counter, told me to grab a rideshare, and walked out because her flight to Miami was non-refundable. 5 days later, he had the nerve to send me a casual text asking how things were going. He had no idea I had just locked him out of his own life forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button if you have ever had to cut dead weight out of your life. The pain hit me like a freight train, tearing through my lower back and radiating down my legs. I gripped the edge of our kitchen island, my knuckles turning white as another contraction ripped through my body. The warm rush of water soaking into my maternity leggings and pooling onto the expensive hardwood floors confirmed what my body was already screaming. This baby was coming, and he was coming fast. I dropped to my knees, gasping for breath. DeAndre, my husband of 4 years, stood 10 feet away. He was wearing his custom-tailored navy suit, the one he usually saved for big presentations at his supply chain management firm. But today was not a work day. Today was a Saturday. He adjusted his silk tie and looked down at me, his expression completely devoid of panic or concern. It was a look of mild inconvenience. "Are you seriously doing this right now?" he asked, his voice laced with heavy irritation. "I told you we need to leave for the airport in 10 minutes. I could barely form words through the blinding pain. "DeAndre, my water just broke. The baby is coming. Call an ambulance or get me to the car. Please." Instead of rushing to my side, DeAndre walked past the kitchen island, completely sidestepping the puddle on the floor. He picked up a bright pink designer suitcase by the front door. The suitcase did not belong to me. It belonged to Vanessa. Vanessa was the childhood best friend of DeAndre. She was standing by the entryway mirror, carefully applying a fresh coat of red lipstick. She wore a tight sundress and oversized sunglasses, acting completely oblivious to the fact that a medical emergency was happening less than 15 feet away from her. She popped her lips together and turned to look at me, her eyes scanning my sweating, trembling form with a mixture of amusement and disgust. "DeAndre, we are going to hit traffic," Vanessa whined, dragging out the vowels in her high-pitched voice. "They overbook those Miami flights all the time. If I miss check-in, they will not give me a refund." DeAndre sighed deeply, running a hand over his perfectly groomed fade. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. I watched in absolute horror as he pulled out a single $20 bill and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. It fluttered down, landing next to the fruit bowl. "Just grab a ride, Corinne," he said casually, picking up her pink suitcase. "The hospital is only 10 minutes down the road. You have the app on your phone, right?" I stared at him, my brain struggling to process the sheer absurdity of his words. "You are leaving me." I choked out another contraction, squeezing my abdomen so hard I saw stars. "You are leaving your wife in labor to take another woman to the airport. She is my best friend, Corinne." DeAndre snapped back, his tone defensive and sharp. "I promised her a ride weeks ago. Do not try to make me the bad guy because your timing is terrible." Vanessa leaned against the doorframe, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Corinne," she sneered, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You will be fine, girl. Women do this every single day. It is just a little pain. You do not need him to hold your hand while you push." "Come on, DeAndre. My flight board's in 2 hours." DeAndre did not even look back at me. He opened the front door, ushered Vanessa outside, and let the heavy oak door swing shut behind him. The click of the latch echoed through the empty house. I lay there on the floor, the cold wood pressing against my cheek as reality washed over me. I was completely alone. The man who vowed to protect me had abandoned me and our unborn child for a woman who treated my existence as a minor nuisance. Her smug laughter echoed in my ears as I realized his deep betrayal. As I dragged myself toward my phone, every agonizing inch felt like a physical manifestation of my marriage. This was not the first time DeAndre chose Vanessa. My mind flashed back to last January during a terrible winter storm. I had been sick with the flu, running a high fever. I asked DeAndre to go to the pharmacy for my prescription. Instead, his phone rang. It was Vanessa crying out about her flat tire. DeAndre grabbed his keys and told me to drink water. He left me shivering with a fever for 4 hours. When he finally returned smelling of expensive perfume and restaurant food, he mentioned he took Vanessa to dinner to calm her nerves. He completely forgot my medicine. I stood in the freezing rain the next morning waiting for a bus because he was too tired to drive me. I made excuses for him then. I told myself he was just a loyal friend. But lying in a puddle of my own making, I finally saw the undeniable truth. DeAndre was not a good man with a needy friend. He was a selfish man who was living a double life right in front of my very own face. My fingers shook violently as I unlocked my phone. Calling an ambulance would take too long, and I knew the dispatcher would ask questions I did not have the breath to answer. I scrolled to my recent contacts and pressed the name of my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. She was a retired emergency room nurse and the only person in this neighborhood I truly trusted. She answered on the second ring. I only managed to gasp out 2 words before she understood. 5 minutes later, she burst through my unlocked back door, taking control of the situation with the calm authority of a seasoned medical professional. She grabbed my hospital bag, helped me into a fresh pair of sweatpants, and practically carried me to her sturdy sedan. As Mrs. Higgins navigated the Atlanta traffic with aggressive efficiency, I pulled out my phone again. I needed someone from my family to know what was happening. Since my own parents had passed away years ago, I dialed the only family I had left, my mother-in-law, Shirley. Shirley was a formidable woman who practically ran her megachurch. She cared more about how things looked to her congregation than how they actually were. She worshipped the ground DeAndre walked on, viewing him as the ultimate high-value man, and treated me as if I should be eternally grateful that he had chosen me. The phone rang 4 times before she finally picked up. Loud chatter and the clinking of glasses echoed in the background. "What is it, Corinne?" Shirley answered, her tone thick with annoyance. "I am very busy right now." "Shirley," I managed to say, gripping the door handle as a massive contraction hit. "I am in labor. I am heading to the emergency room right now." DeAndre left. "I am alone. Please, can you come to the hospital?" There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Corinne, stop being so needy." I blinked, fighting through the haze of pain. "Needy? I am having a baby, Shirley. Your grandson." "I know you are having a baby," Shirley retorted sharply. "But DeAndre told me he had to take Vanessa to the airport. He is a good man helping a friend in need. You cannot expect him to drop everything just because your timing is inconvenient. Women have been having babies since the dawn of time without making such a fuss." I could not believe what I was hearing. "He left me on the floor, Shirley." "Well, you are clearly on your way to the hospital now, so you figured it out," Shirley said, completely unfazed. "Becky and I are at a very exclusive wine tasting event to select the menu for the church charity gala next month. I am not leaving right now and causing a scene. Call me when the baby is actually out, and maybe we will stop by tomorrow." Before I could say another word, I heard Becky laughing in the background. Becky was the wife of Jamal, my white sister-in-law, who Shirley treated like absolute royalty because she supposedly came from old money. I heard her distinct voice through the receiver saying loudly, "Tell her to just breathe and stop seeking attention, Shirley. We have a Pinot Noir to taste." The line went dead. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, the sting of their collective rejection burning hotter than the physical pain tearing through my body. Mrs. Higgins reached over and squeezed my knee. "You do not need them, honey," she said, her voice fierce and kind. "You are going to do this, and you are going to be magnificent." And I did. 14 agonizing hours later, I gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby boy named Leo. I held him to my chest, looking down at his perfect little face, and I made a silent vow. I would never let anyone treat us like an inconvenience again. 5 days later, I finally returned home from the hospital. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as Mrs. Higgins helped me carry Leo inside. The house was exactly as I had left it, but the energy felt entirely different. It was no longer a shared home. It was a fortress, and I was its only guardian. I walked up to the front door and smiled at the brand-new smart lock shining on the heavy wood. I had called a locksmith from my hospital bed the morning after Leo was born. As I settled onto the living room sofa with my sleeping son, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a WhatsApp message from DeAndre sent from his sunny vacation in Miami. "Hey babe, how is it going? I am back from the airport but the front door is jammed. My key is not working. Open up." I looked at the message, reading his casual, arrogant words. He actually thought he could abandon me in a pool of my own fluids, fly off with his mistress disguised as a friend, and come back to a warm dinner and a waiting wife. He thought I was just a small-time consultant who needed his protection and his name to survive in this upscale neighborhood. He had no idea who I really was. I picked up my phone right then, feeling nothing but cold, absolute clarity. I did not type out a long, angry paragraph. I did not demand complicated explanations or offer him any tears. Instead, I simply typed 5 final words. "You do not live here anymore." The scene on my tablet was a masterclass in entitlement. DeAndre had marched up to the front door, fully expecting his code to work. When the keypad flashed red and buzzed a sharp denial, he didn't assume the lock was broken. He assumed I was being difficult. He slammed his palm against the heavy oak door, shouting my name, completely oblivious to the fact that his reign in this house was over. I sat on the velvet sofa in my living room, the quiet hum of the house wrapping around me as I gently swayed baby Leo. I had spent the last 5 days surviving the physical trauma of a neglected labor, but my mind had been sharp cold and relentlessly calculating. I had contacted my attorneys, secured the property, and prepared the paperwork. Every tear I might have shed for my marriage had dried up on the floor of this very house while DeAndre was driving Vanessa to the airport. It took 45 minutes for DeAndre to realize he wasn't getting in, and exactly that long for him to summon his audience. I heard the tires crunch on the driveway and glanced at the security feed. A silver Mercedes SUV had pulled up behind DeAndre's sedan. My stomach tightened with a familiar, bitter recognition. I had essentially paid for that car. Out stepped Shirley, my mother-in-law, dressed in a floral church suit on a Tuesday afternoon, gripping her imitation pearls as if bracing for a holy war. Behind her was Jamal, DeAndre's older brother, looking perpetually exhausted by his own financial failures. And finally, stepping out of the passenger side with a haughty sigh and an iced matcha latte in hand, was Becky. Becky was Jamal's wife. She was a woman who had constructed her entire personality around the illusion of being from generational wealth. She wore a pristine tennis skirt and oversized designer sunglasses, treating her arrival at my home like a slumming expedition. Shirley worshipped Becky, constantly weaponizing Becky's supposed old money background to remind me of my place. I watched the monitor as they stormed my porch. Shirley marched straight to the door and began pounding with the flat of her hand. The ring camera caught every word of her shrill, carrying voice. "You locked my son out of his house," Shirley screamed, her voice vibrating with performative outrage. "You classless woman." DeAndre stood behind her, arms crossed, letting his mother fight his battle. I zoomed in on the camera feed just in time to catch Becky leaning toward Jamal, a sneer playing on her lips. She didn't whisper quietly enough. "In my family, property is always shared," Becky said, shaking her head in mock pity. "This is just so ghetto, Jamal. Who changes locks on their own husband?" Hearing Becky talk about property and tackiness ignited a very specific, very cold rage inside me. I stared at the silver Mercedes parked in my driveway. Just over a year ago, DeAndre had cornered me in our kitchen, demanding we pull $30,000 from our joint savings. Jamal was drowning in high-interest debt, desperate to keep up with the lifestyle Becky demanded. Shirley had orchestrated the entire bailout. "We must protect the family image," she had commanded. I remembered Becky sitting in Shirley's living room squeezing out fake tears, claiming she was simply too embarrassed to pull up to the country club in a Honda. She needed a luxury SUV to maintain her social standing. DeAndre, terrified of looking like a man who couldn't provide for his family, forced the transfer against my fierce objections. He handed Jamal and Becky the down payment for that exact Mercedes they had just driven to my house to evict me. They drove a car paid for by my sweat to come stand on my porch and call me classless. I gently handed the sleeping baby to Mrs. Higgins, who had quietly entered the living room. She took Leo with a firm, supportive nod and retreated down the hall. I smoothed the fabric of my silk blouse, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked to the foyer. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. The bright afternoon sunlight spilled into the entryway. Shirley had her fist raised to strike the wood again, but she froze when she saw me. I stood tall, my expression completely impassive. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't give them the hysterical broken woman they had all come expecting to mock. "What is going on here, Shirley?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly controlled. "You are disturbing my neighborhood." Shirley dropped her hand to her hip, jutting her chin forward. "Do not use that tone with me, Corinne. You have some explaining to do. You have lost your mind changing the locks on this house. My son just got off a flight after exhausting himself handling business, and you pull a stunt like this. Give him the new keys right now before I call the police and have you removed." DeAndre stepped forward, puffing out his chest to look physically intimidating. "Look, Corinne, I am tired. Vanessa had a crisis, and I stepped up as a friend. Stop being insecure. Let me inside so I can shower, and maybe we can talk about how you are overreacting later." Becky sighed loudly, shaking her iced matcha. "Seriously, Corinne, you are making a scene for the whole street. Just apologize and let him in." I looked at Becky, my gaze sweeping slowly from her tennis shoes to her designer sunglasses. "I am not making a scene, Becky," I replied smoothly. "Your mother-in-law is the one screaming on a porch she does not own. And speaking of owning things, I suggest you be careful driving that Mercedes home. It would be a terrible shame if the bank found out Jamal missed his last 2 payments." Jamal choked on a cough. Becky's jaw dropped, the smugness instantly vanishing from her face, replaced by sheer panic. Shirley whipped her head around to look at Jamal, but I didn't give them time to process the hit. I turned my attention squarely back to DeAndre and his mother. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out a thick, folded document bearing a bright red legal seal. I didn't throw it at him. I simply extended my hand and waited for him to take it. DeAndre frowned, looking from the document to my face before snatching it out of my hand. "What is this garbage?" he demanded, unfolding the thick parchment. "That is a formal notice of eviction, accompanied by an emergency restraining order," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational volume that forced them all to lean in to hear me. "You see, Shirley, you keep talking about your son's house. But this house does not belong to DeAndre. It never has." DeAndre scanned the first page, his eyes darting across the legal jargon. He scoffed, a nervous, breathy sound escaping his throat. "You are crazy. We bought this house together after we got married. It is marital property, Corinne. You cannot evict me from marital property." I tilted my head, feigning a look of mild sympathy. "You really should read the closing documents you signed, DeAndre. You never bought this house. A limited liability company called C-Tech Holdings bought this house entirely in cash. You signed a standard residential lease agreement listing you as a tenant because you insisted your name be on some paperwork for your ego. You pay rent into the joint account, which covers the property taxes, but you have zero ownership stake." Shirley's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You are lying," she spat, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "My son is a director at a major firm. He provides for you. You are nothing but a minor consultant working from a home office. He paid for this house." "He certainly likes to pretend he did," I agreed mildly. "But C-Tech Holdings is the sole proprietor of this estate, and I am the sole managing director of C-Tech Holdings. I own this property, Shirley. Every brick, every window, every blade of grass. And as the landlord, I am terminating the month-to-month tenancy of this man." DeAndre crumpled the papers in his fist, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You cannot do this," he roared, stepping toward me. "I will not let you take my house." I didn't flinch. I didn't take a single step backward. I stared directly into his eyes and let the silence stretch until he stopped moving. "You have exactly 10 minutes," I said, checking my watch. 10 minutes to walk into the mudroom, grab your golf clubs, and whatever fits into a single garbage bag. If you are not off my property by the time that 10 minutes is up, the local police department, who already have a copy of that signed restraining order, will arrive to escort you off the premises in handcuffs. Jamal grabbed his brother's arm, pulling him back slightly. "Man, she is not playing," he muttered, looking nervously up and down the street, expecting squad cars to appear at any second. DeAndre shook his brother off, his breathing ragged. He looked at the house, then at his mother, then finally back to me. The realization that he had absolutely no leverage was dawning on him, but his narcissism wouldn't allow him to surrender gracefully. He puffed his chest out one last time, spit flying from his lips as he yelled at me. "You want to play lawyer, Corinne?" he shouted, pointing directly at my face. "You want to try and ruin me over a simple favor to a friend? Fine, let us play. I will drag you through the mud. I am filing for divorce tomorrow morning. I am taking half the value of this house in front of a judge. I am filing for full physical custody of that baby to get maximum child support from you. And I am going to have my attorneys rip apart your little IT startup and take half of that too. You are going to be left with absolutely nothing." I looked at him standing there in his expensive suit, making threats he had no power to execute. He was so completely detached from reality, so blinded by his own perceived superiority, that he actually thought he could destroy me. I placed my hand on the edge of the heavy oak door. "Good luck finding a lawyer who works for free, DeAndre," I said softly. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" he demanded. I smiled, a slow, cold smile that finally made the color drain from his face. I stepped backward into the foyer and began to close the door. "I guess you will find out when you try to buy Vanessa dinner tonight," I said through the narrowing gap. I pulled the door firmly shut, hearing the deadbolt slide securely into place. The sound of Shirley screaming through the wood was instantly muffled. I turned my back to the door and walked straight to the kitchen island where my laptop lay open and waiting. The screen glowed bright, displaying the administrative dashboard of my corporate financial network. He wanted to threaten my company. He wanted to threaten my child. He wanted to claim my assets. I sat down at the stool, flexed my fingers, and brought the cursor over to the central command node that controlled the joint financial accounts I had allowed him to use to maintain his facade of wealth. I hit a single keystroke. The screen refreshed, displaying a bright green confirmation bar. "Let us see you pay a lawyer when your accounts are frozen," I whispered to the empty kitchen. 2 weeks passed since I clicked that button and watched the green confirmation bar seal DeAndre out of our finances. He spent those 14 days leaving unhinged voicemails threatening to destroy me. He thought the frozen accounts were a temporary banking error, a minor inconvenience he could fix by shouting at a teller. When the reality set in that I had legally severed his access to my capital, he rushed to hire the loudest, most aggressive divorce attorney he could find on credit. He wanted to intimidate me. He wanted to drag me into a sterile conference room and bully me back into submission. The mediation took place in a high-rise glass building in downtown Atlanta. The room smelled of expensive floor wax and stale coffee. I sat next to my attorney Marcus, a quiet man who rarely spoke unless it was strictly necessary. I wore a tailored cream suit, my posture relaxed, holding a pen loosely between my fingers. I had arranged for Mrs. Higgins to watch Leo for the afternoon, so my mind was entirely focused on the battlefield in front of me. The heavy wooden door swung open and DeAndre strutted in. He was wearing a custom charcoal suit, trying to project the image of a powerful executive. But I could see the slight tremor in his jaw, the sweat beading near his hairline. He was desperate. Right behind him walked his attorney, a man named Sterling, who wore a suit that was a little too tight and a watch that was trying too hard to be noticed. Sterling carried a leather briefcase and a smug expression, dropping his files onto the polished mahogany table with a loud thud. DeAndre did not even look at me. He pulled out his chair and sat down, crossing his arms over his chest. He was playing the role of the aggrieved husband, the provider who had been wronged by an ungrateful wife. Sterling cleared his throat and opened his laptop, leaning forward with the predatory smile of a man who thought he was dealing with an amateur. "Let us get right to the point," Sterling began, his voice booming in the quiet room. "My client is a reasonable man. He is willing to settle this matter quickly and quietly to spare everyone the embarrassment of a public trial. But we expect a fair and equitable division of assets. DeAndre has been the primary breadwinner for the duration of this marriage. He has supported Corinne through her various career transitions and provided the stability she needed to pursue her hobbies." I felt Marcus shift slightly in his chair next to me, but I kept my face perfectly still. Hobbies. That was the word DeAndre had used to describe my company for years. Whenever I stayed up until 3 in the morning securing data networks for corporate clients, he would complain that the typing noise was keeping him awake. Whenever I traveled for security conferences, he would accuse me of trying to avoid my duties at home. He had never once asked me what I actually did for a living. He only cared that my income paid the property taxes so he could spend his salary on maintaining his flashy image. Sterling pulled a crisp white sheet of paper from his folder and slid it toward us. "Here is our initial proposal. My client is requesting 50% of the residential property. He is also requesting primary physical custody of the child, which will of course require standard child support payments from your client. Furthermore, since my client financially supported Corinne while she built her little IT consulting business, he is entitled to a 50% equity stake in Aegis Cyber." DeAndre finally looked at me, a self-satisfied smirk resting on his lips. He thought he had me cornered. He actually believed that by threatening to take my son and my home, I would break down and surrender my company just to make him go away. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. Marcus did not touch the piece of paper Sterling had slid across the table. Instead, he calmly opened his own briefcase. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with anticipation. Marcus pulled out a massive black binder, placing it on the table with a solid thud that echoed off the glass walls. "I am afraid your proposal is fundamentally flawed," Marcus said, his voice smooth and conversational. "Your client is not entitled to the property, he is not entitled to spousal support, and he is certainly not entitled to a single share of Aegis Cyber." Sterling scoffed, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. "Oh, come on, Marcus. Georgia is an equitable distribution state. You cannot hide behind some flimsy prenuptial agreement. We know she started that consulting firm after they were legally married. DeAndre bankrolled her dreams. He paid the bills while she fixed laptops for local businesses. He gets his half." I watched DeAndre puff out his chest, nodding along with his lawyer. He really believed the lies he was paying this man to tell. He had convinced himself that his mid-level management salary had somehow funded my life, when in reality, his money barely covered his own country club dues and designer suits. Marcus opened the thick binder and flipped to the first tab. He extracted a stack of documents bearing the official seal of the state of Delaware. He handed a copy to Sterling and slid another toward DeAndre. "My client does not have a prenuptial agreement," Marcus explained patiently. "She has an irrevocable blind trust established in Delaware a full 2 years before she even met your client. Every asset she has acquired, including the residential property and the entirety of Aegis Cyber, is owned and protected by this trust. DeAndre never contributed a single cent to its formation or its growth. Legally speaking, Corinne does not own these assets directly. The trust does. Therefore, they are not marital property. They are untouchable." Sterling picked up the documents, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. I watched his confident smirk slowly slide off his face. His brow furrowed as he flipped to the second page, then the third. The air in the room grew distinctly colder as the reality of my financial fortress began to dawn on him. DeAndre looked confused. He turned to his lawyer. "What does that mean, Sterling? Tell him we are taking half." Sterling ignored his client, staring hard at the paperwork. "This is a highly sophisticated asset protection structure," he muttered almost to himself. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. "You went through a lot of trouble to hide a small-time consulting firm. Why would a freelance tech support worker need a Delaware blind trust? I uncrossed my legs and placed my hands flat on the table. I leaned forward, maintaining direct eye contact with Sterling. I am not a freelance tech support worker, Sterling, and Aegis Cyber is not a small-time consulting firm. Marcus flipped to the next tab in the binder. He pulled out a certified copy of my recent corporate tax returns and an unclassified summary of my company portfolio. He slid them directly in front of DeAndre. I suggest you look closely at those numbers, Marcus said quietly. DeAndre picked up the tax returns. I watched his eyes track across the top line, then drop down to the gross revenue section. He froze. His breathing stopped completely. His eyes widened to the point that I could see the whites all the way around his irises. The paper in his hands began to tremble. "What is this?" He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "This cannot be real. This is fake. You printed this out to scare me." Sterling leaned over and looked at the documents. He let out a low, sharp breath. He quickly flipped through the portfolio summary, reading the names of my clients. Major financial institutions, government defense contractors, multinational logistics corporations. Aegis Cyber is a military-grade data protection and cybersecurity firm, Marcus stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Corinne is the founder and chief executive officer. She holds government security clearances that your client could not even dream of. The company was recently valued at a figure that makes your client's demands look entirely ridiculous. And as I stated before, it is completely insulated within the blind trust. Your client gets nothing. DeAndre dropped the papers onto the table as if they had burned his fingers. His face went from pale to a deep mottled red. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight silk collar. For 4 years he had treated me like a naive little girl playing on her computer. He had paraded me around his friends claiming he was the provider while quietly drowning in credit card debt to keep up his image. He had stolen from our joint savings to fund his mistress and her fertility treatments, believing I would never notice the missing funds because I was just too simple-minded to understand finance. Now the truth was staring him right in the face. I was not just successful, I was wealthy on a scale he could barely comprehend, and he had absolutely no legal right to touch a single penny of it. "You lied to me!" DeAndre suddenly roared, slamming both of his fists onto the mahogany table. The coffee cups rattled violently. He jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You hid millions of dollars from me. You sat there in my house eating my food, acting like you were nothing while you were hoarding all this money." "It is not your house, DeAndre," I said, my voice soft but slicing through his tantrum like a blade. "And I never lied to you. You simply never cared enough to ask what I actually did. You were too busy trying to impress Vanessa and your mother to pay attention to the woman sitting right in front of you." Sterling stood up, trying to pull his client back into his chair. "DeAndre, sit down. We need to regroup and discuss this outside." But DeAndre was beyond reason. His entire ego had just been shattered, and his narcissism demanded retaliation. He shook off his lawyer's hand and leaned across the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you are so smart, Corinne?" he shouted, saliva flying from his lips. "You think you can just lock me out of my life and walk away with millions? You hid assets during a marriage. I do not care what kind of fancy Delaware trust you have. I am calling the IRS today. I am reporting you for tax evasion and fraud. I am going to call every single one of those government clients on that list and tell them their precious security expert is a lying, deceptive fraud. I will drag your name through the dirt. I will ruin your company reputation so badly, you will be begging me to take a settlement." He was panting heavily, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own rage. He glared at me, waiting for me to flinch. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg him not to destroy the business I had spent my entire life building. He wanted to see fear in my eyes. Instead, I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the calm, calculated expression of a predator watching its prey walk willingly into a trap. I slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my cream jacket. I picked up my pen and slipped it into my purse. I looked at Sterling, who was watching me with a growing sense of dread. He knew his client had just made a massive mistake, but he did not know exactly what it was yet. I turned my gaze back to DeAndre. I leaned across the table, bringing my face just inches from his. The air between us was electric with tension. "Go right ahead, DeAndre," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed perfectly in the quiet room. "Call the IRS. Call my corporate clients. Tell them whatever stories you want. I welcome the scrutiny. My books are spotless, and my trust is legally impenetrable." I paused, letting my words sink in. I watched his chest rise and fall, his eyes locked on mine. "But before you pick up that phone," I continued, my tone dripping with absolute ice, "you might want to check the server logs at your own supply chain company." DeAndre froze. The aggressive posture instantly vanished. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "You see, DeAndre," I said, tilting my head slightly, "you are right about one thing. I am very good at cybersecurity. I am exceptionally good at tracking digital footprints and finding hidden data. And when you threatened my company, I decided to do a little routine maintenance on the home network you used for your remote work." Sterling looked sharply at his client. "DeAndre, what is she talking about?" DeAndre could not speak. The red flush of anger had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. I picked up my purse and slung the strap over my shoulder. I looked at the flashy lawyer, who was now sweating almost as much as his client. "You should ask him, Sterling," I suggested politely. "Ask him about the ghost vendors. Ask him about the routing numbers that funnel corporate funds into offshore accounts. He wanted to talk about hiding money and committing fraud. I think that is a wonderful topic for our next mediation session." I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy wooden door. Marcus quietly packed his binder and followed me, his face a mask of professional neutrality. As my hand closed around the brass door handle, I heard DeAndre finally find his voice. "Corinne," he gasped out, sounding like a man who was suddenly suffocating. "Wait. Please wait." I did not turn around. I simply opened the door and walked out, leaving him trapped in a room with a lawyer he could not afford and a mountain of lies that was about to collapse on top of him. The satisfying click of that heavy wooden door closing behind me was a sound I replayed in my mind for the rest of the week. I had left DeAndre trapped in a mediation room with a lawyer he could not afford, and a reality he could no longer deny. But my husband and his family were not the type of people to accept defeat gracefully. They operated on delusion and public validation. When the truth became too heavy to carry, they simply painted over it with a thicker layer of lies. This was exactly why 3 days later, a thick gold foil envelope arrived on my desk. It was a formal invitation to the Greater Grace Tabernacle Spring Gala. Shirley had sent it directly to my corporate office, bypassing my home address completely. She knew exactly what she was doing. This was not a gesture of peace or an attempt at family reconciliation. This was a summons. She wanted me on her territory, surrounded by her congregation, so she could control the narrative of my marriage falling apart. The Greater Grace Tabernacle was not just a church. It was a social institution in Atlanta where the affluent gathered to display their blessings and judge the shortcomings of others. Shirley was a high-ranking deaconess who ruled the fellowship hall with an iron fist and an imitation pearl necklace. She thrived on the social hierarchy of the congregation. For her, the gala was the ultimate battlefield, and she intended to use it to humiliate the woman who had dared to lock her precious son out of his own home. I could have thrown the invitation in the trash. I could have stayed home with my son and enjoyed a quiet evening of peace. But I knew that my absence would only give Shirley the empty space she needed to spin her web of lies. I decided to accept her invitation. I decided it was time to burn her entire stage to the ground. When I arrived at the country club ballroom that the church had rented for the evening, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over dozens of round tables covered in crisp white linen and tall floral centerpieces. A live jazz band played soft gospel melodies in the corner, while waiters in black vests circulated with trays of sparkling cider and hors d'oeuvres. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that draped perfectly against my frame. I did not wear flashy jewelry or carry a logo-covered handbag. True wealth whispers while fake wealth screams. I walked into the ballroom with my head held high, projecting the absolute calm of a woman who held every single card in the deck. It took less than 5 minutes for Shirley to spot me. She was standing near the main stage wearing a lavender suit and a wide-brimmed hat that completely defied gravity. Next to her stood the senior pastor, a man who Shirley constantly courted for social favor. And standing right beside the pastor, clutching a glass of sparkling water with both hands, was Becky. Becky was the wife of Jamal, the older brother of DeAndre. She was a white woman who had successfully convinced the entire family that she was the heir to a massive generational fortune from Connecticut. Shirley absolutely worshipped Becky. In the complex racial and social politics of their family, Shirley viewed having an old money white daughter-in-law as the ultimate status symbol. Shirley used Becky as a weapon against me, constantly praising her refined tastes and her supposedly vast family wealth to highlight my own background of working my way up from nothing. Becky played the part perfectly. She wore a glittering silver sequined gown that caught the light with every movement, and resting against her collarbone was a massive diamond tennis necklace that looked heavy enough to strain her neck. As I approached the buffet table to pour myself a glass of water, I saw Shirley lean into the pastor. She did not bother to lower her voice. She wanted me to hear every word. "Pastor, you remember my daughter-in-law, Becky," Shirley said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "She comes from such a wonderful traditional family up north. They understand the true value of marriage and loyalty. Not like some women today who run at the first sign of trouble. We are just praying for the fatherless children in our community. It is so tragic when a bitter single mother breaks a home apart out of pure selfishness." The pastor offered a polite, uncomfortable nod and quickly excused himself to greet other guests. Shirley shot me a triumphant glare while Becky offered a small, patronizing smile. Becky adjusted her heavy diamond necklace and stepped away from Shirley, walking directly over to the buffet table where I was standing. She wanted to twist the knife personally. "It is so brave of you to show up here alone, Corinne," Becky said, her voice soft and full of fake sympathy. "I told Jamal this morning that I could simply never be a single mother. It just seems so chaotic and unstable. In my family, property and marriage are sacred institutions. We prioritize stability. We just do not believe in giving up when things get hard. But I suppose people from different backgrounds have different values." She reached up and touched the diamonds resting on her chest, making sure the stones caught the light from the chandeliers above us. It was a calculated microaggression designed to make me feel small and unrefined. She wanted me to look at her diamonds and feel the crushing weight of my own supposed failure. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, enjoying the crisp chill against my throat. I looked at Becky, my eyes tracing the glittering stones around her neck. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or intimidation. "It is a stunning piece of jewelry, Becky," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and conversational. "The stones look like Asher cuts. What is that, maybe 60 carats total weight? It is truly beautiful. But I do have to ask how you managed to make the final payment on it. It must have been quite difficult considering Jamal had his primary platinum card declined for a tank of gas at a convenience store this morning." Becky froze. Her hand dropped from her neck as if the diamonds had suddenly turned to hot coals. The patronizing smile vanished from her face, completely replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Her pale skin lost all its color. She glanced around nervously, terrified that someone might have overheard my words. "I do not know what you are talking about," Becky stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "Jamal has excellent credit. My family is very comfortable. You are just being spiteful because your own husband left you." I placed my glass down on the crisp white linen of the buffet table. I leaned in slightly, closing the physical distance between us so my words would land with maximum impact. "Your family filed for Chapter 7, bankruptcy in Ohio, 5 years ago. Becky." I whispered, my tone completely clinical and detached. Your father lost his hardware store and your mother works part-time at a floral shop. There is no generational wealth in Connecticut. There is no trust fund. You are broke. And Jamal is drowning to keep up the illusion that you are rich. Becky gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning stark white. How could you possibly know anything about my family? She hissed, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Because I own the bank. Becky, I replied. You see, when you demand a diamond tennis necklace to wear to a church gala, and your husband has already maxed out all his traditional credit lines, he has to get creative. Jamal took out a $50,000 high-yield unsecured personal loan through a boutique lending firm called Apex Financial Solutions. He took it out 3 months ago at a predatory interest rate, just so you could keep playing the role of a rich socialite. You thought Apex was just an independent lender. What you and Jamal did not know is that my corporate umbrella acquired Apex Financial Solutions last quarter as part of an investment diversification strategy. I own the firm, I see the ledgers, I review the risk assessment reports. Becky looked as though she might actually vomit right there on the polished ballroom floor. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for Jamal in the crowded room. I saw his income verification documents, Becky. I continued, refusing to let her off the hook. I saw the pay stubs he submitted to secure that $50,000 loan. Jamal is not just working his regular day job anymore. He has been taking graveyard shifts loading freight at a logistics warehouse across town. He works from midnight until 6 in the morning lifting heavy cargo just to pay the minimum monthly interest on your fake lifestyle. Have you not noticed how exhausted he looks? Have you not seen the calluses building up on his hands? Your husband is destroying his physical health so his mother can brag about your diamonds to a pastor. Shirley had noticed the tension from across the room. She marched over to the buffet table, her lavender hat bobbing aggressively. What is going on over here? She demanded, stepping between me and Becky. Corinne, if you are harassing my daughter-in-law out of jealousy, I will have security remove you from this building. I am not harassing anyone, Shirley, I said calmly. I was just admiring her necklace and discussing the warehouse where Jamal works the night shift to pay for it. Shirley gasped loudly, a dramatic sound of pure offense. My son is a king, she declared, her voice rising enough to attract the attention of nearby tables. My son does not do manual labor in a warehouse. He is a senior manager. He comes from a proud, educated family. You are a liar, Corinne. You are just trying to drag them down to your level because DeAndre left you. Jamal had heard his mother shouting. He rushed over to the buffet table, his tuxedo jacket looking slightly too large for his frame. He had lost weight. The dark circles under his eyes were deep and bruised, looking exactly like a man who had not slept a full night in months. What is happening? Jamal asked, looking frantically between his mother, his trembling wife, and me. Jamal, tell this bitter woman that you do not work in a warehouse, Shirley commanded him, pointing a finger at my chest. Tell her that you provide for your wife properly. Jamal looked at me, and then he looked down at the floor. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout could have been. He could not look his mother in the eye. He could not defend the illusion anymore because he knew I had the proof. His silence was a total, absolute confession. Shirley staggered backward, her hand flying to her chest. She looked at Jamal as if he were a complete stranger. The reality that her perfect upper-class family was actually surviving on blue-collar night shift wages was destroying her entire worldview. The facade was shattering in real time. Before Shirley could completely process the humiliation, DeAndre pushed his way through the gathering crowd. He smelled strongly of expensive bourbon, clearly having visited the open bar several times to soothe his bruised ego from our mediation session. He stepped in front of Jamal, throwing his shoulders back in a protective, aggressive stance. Leave my brother alone, Corinne. DeAndre sneered, his words slurring slightly. You think 50 grand is big money. You think a little personal loan scares us. We are not afraid of your corporate garbage. My firm is launching our initial public offering next quarter. My executive bonus is going to be massive. That bonus will wipe out every single pathetic little debt Jamal has in a matter of seconds. We do not need your money, and we do not need your condescension. My family takes care of its own. He smiled a wet, arrogant smile, believing he had just delivered the ultimate killing blow to my argument. He thought the promise of his future corporate wealth would put me back in my place and restore his mother's pride. I looked at DeAndre taking in his wrinkled suit and his bourbon-soaked confidence. I let a genuine, relaxed smile spread across my face. It was the same cold smile I had given him in the mediation room when he realized his bank accounts were empty. "Will it wipe out the debt, DeAndre?" I asked, my voice echoing perfectly in the sudden quiet of the room. "Will your massive executive bonus pay off your brother's warehouse loans, or will it pay for Vanessa and her next round of in vitro fertilization?" The silence in the country club ballroom was so absolute you could hear the ice melting in the glasses on the buffet table. DeAndre stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping. I did not wait for his pathetic attempts at an excuse, or for Shirley to recover from her shock. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the megachurch fundraising gala, leaving them all drowning in the reality of their own pathetic lies. I drove back to my actual life, the one I had built with my own two hands, and focused entirely on the only thing that mattered, which was my son Leo. 3 days later, I was sitting in my corner office at the headquarters of Aegis Cyber. My firm occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass high-rise in downtown Atlanta, and it was a physical manifestation of my power. The environment was pristine and highly controlled. You do not just walk into my company without passing through 2 layers of biometric security and a dedicated team of ex-military guards. The air smelled of expensive espresso and ozone from the massive server farms housed on the floor below. I was in the middle of reviewing a highly classified risk assessment for a federal defense contractor when the flashing red light on my internal communication console began to pulse. It was a highly unusual occurrence. I pressed the silver button to connect the line. "Mrs. Wilson, we have a situation in the main ground floor lobby." "Marcus, my head of corporate security," said his deep voice, completely devoid of panic but laced with heavy disapproval. "A woman claiming to be a close family friend is causing a significant disturbance at the front desk. She is crying loudly, attempting to bypass the turnstiles and demanding to see you immediately. She says her name is Vanessa." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, pressing my fingertips together. The sheer audacity of this woman was almost exhausting. I pulled up the lobby security feed on my secondary monitor. There she was, pacing frantically near the reception desk. She was wearing a tight white sundress that looked entirely inappropriate for a corporate environment, and she was clutching an oversized fake Chanel bag to her chest like a shield. She looked chaotic and entirely out of place among the suited executives and engineers moving through the lobby. "Send her up to conference room B, Marcus," I instructed smoothly, keeping my eyes locked on the monitor. "Do not let her wander the halls. Escort her directly to the room and have 2 guards stand inside by the doors. I will be down in exactly 5 minutes." I took my time finishing my email before standing up and smoothing the fabric of my tailored navy trousers. I picked up a single manila folder from my desk, the one containing the financial forensic reports I had spent the weekend compiling, and walked down the quiet carpeted hallway toward the conference room. When I opened the heavy glass door, Vanessa was sitting at the long, polished table, dabbing her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Her oversized bag was resting obnoxiously on the glass surface. The moment she saw me enter, she immediately launched into her performance. "Corinne, thank God you are here," she sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured grief and desperation. "I am so sorry to just show up at your work like this, but I was completely desperate. You have to listen to me. Please, Corinne, woman to woman, you have to understand my heart." I stood at the head of the table looking down at her. I did not offer her a glass of water. I did not offer her a comforting smile. I simply placed my hands on the glass and waited. "I am listening, Vanessa," I said, my voice completely flat and echoing slightly in the large, sterile room. She took a ragged breath, wiping a non-existent tear from her cheek and leaning forward. "DeAndre and I never meant to hurt you," she whimpered, putting a hand over her chest. "It just happened. We have known each other since we were kids and we just fell in love. We cannot fight fate. We are soulmates, Corinne. You have to let him go. You have to release the legal hold on the joint bank accounts. We cannot even buy groceries right now. We are trying to start our beautiful blended family, and you are starving us out of pure spite and jealousy. I stared at her, taking in the cheap floral perfume and the incredible delusional entitlement rolling off her in waves. You came to my corporate headquarters to ask me to fund your affair, I asked, my tone dropping to a cold, dangerous register. You helped my husband abandon me while I was literally in active labor on my living room floor so you could fly to a sunny vacation. And now you want me to unfreeze my hard-earned money so you can play house with a man who does not even own the bed he sleeps in. Vanessa dropped the crying act in a fraction of a second. Her face hardened and her eyes narrowed into vicious slits. The sweet, innocent childhood friend vanished completely, replacing the victim with the predator I always knew she was. You selfish, bitter woman, she snarled, standing up so quickly her heavy chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. You have millions of dollars. You do not even need that account to survive. DeAndre deserves that money for putting up with your cold, career-obsessed personality for 4 years. She lunged forward across the glass table, her arm raised high, aiming a vicious, open-handed slap directly at my face. She never even made it halfway. Before I could even blink, Marcus and another security guard stepped out of the shadows near the door. Marcus moved with terrifying precision, catching her wrist mid-air and twisting her arm firmly behind her back. He pinned her against the edge of the conference table with a smooth, professional motion that forced her to gasp in sudden pain. The other guard stepped smoothly between us, forming an impenetrable human shield. "Let me go, you corporate thugs!" Vanessa screamed, thrashing wildly against Marcus, but unable to break his iron grip. "Corinne, tell them to let me go right now. I will sue you for assault. I will call the police." I calmly opened the manila folder I had carried into the room, completely unfazed by her screaming. "Let her go, Marcus," I instructed, keeping my eyes locked on Vanessa. He released her and she stumbled forward, rubbing her wrist and glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder and dropped it onto the glass table. It fluttered down, landing right next to her fake Chanel bag. "You talk about DeAndre deserving that money, Vanessa," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that commanded absolute silence in the room. "Do you know what that specific savings account was actually for?" She looked down at the paper, breathing heavily, refusing to answer. "It was my son's college fund," I continued, the cold maternal anger finally bleeding into my words. "I set up that high-yield savings account the very day I found out I was pregnant. I deposited my own consulting bonuses into it for months to ensure his future was completely secure. And do you know what I found when my forensic accountants went through the ledgers last week?" I tapped my manicured fingernail against the highlighted line on the bank statement. "I found a withdrawal for $120,000 made exactly 2 days before your little trip to Miami," I said. "It is funny, you know. DeAndre told his mother he was taking you to the beach to calm your nerves because you were so stressed. But I am a cybersecurity expert, Vanessa. Tracking digital metadata is what I do for a living. I tracked the location services, the Wi-Fi handshakes, and the cellular tower triangulation on DeAndre's phone during that entire weekend. You were not at the beach. You never even saw the ocean. You spent 4 days sitting in the waiting room at the Ocean View Fertility Institute." Vanessa froze completely. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color rapidly drained from her face, making her heavy foundation look stark and unnatural under the bright fluorescent lights. "That is right, Vanessa," I said, leaning forward slightly until we were almost eye to eye. "He stole $120,000 from his own newborn son's college fund to pay for your elite in vitro fertilization treatments. He stole from my baby to plant yours. You want to talk about starting a blended family? You are trying to build your entire life on money stolen directly from an infant." I expected her to cry for real this time. I expected her to show even a fraction of human decency, guilt, or shame. But Vanessa was exactly the kind of monster DeAndre deserved. She straightened her posture, smoothing down the wrinkled fabric of her tight white dress. She reached out and snatched her fake bag off the table, clutching it tightly to her chest. She looked at me and sneered, a wet, arrogant sound escaping her throat. "So what?" she spat, her voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "He took what was his. He was the man of the house, and he had every right to spend that money on our future. You think you are so smart, Corinne, with your little security guards and your printed bank statements? But you do not know anything about how the real world works." She took a confident step toward the door, her arrogance inexplicably returning in full force. She looked back at me over her shoulder, a cruel, victorious smile stretching across her face. "You think freezing one little savings account matters?" She laughed, a high-pitched grating sound that set my teeth on edge. "There is more where that came from. You have absolutely no idea who you are messing with. DeAndre is moving $2 million through his company next week. We are going to have more money than you could ever dream of holding. And when that transfer clears, we are going to crush your little startup and take custody of that kid just to punish you." She turned and marched out of the conference room, her heels clicking aggressively against the floor until the sound faded down the hallway. Marcus looked at me, waiting for a command to escort her out of the building, but I raised my hand, signaling him to just let her go. I stood alone in the quiet room, the echo of Vanessa's words ringing continuously in my ears. $2 million. I stared blindly at the empty doorway, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. DeAndre was a mid-level supply chain manager at a regional logistics firm. His entire departmental operating budget was barely $500,000 for the fiscal year. He did not have the executive authorization, the financial clearance, or the operational capacity to move $2 million of legitimate corporate funds. Supply chain managers do not authorize transfers of that magnitude without multiple layers of executive sign-off. Unless the pieces suddenly and violently clicked together in my brain. My mind flashed back to the ghost vendors I had casually noticed during my quick sweep of his home network months ago. I remembered the late-night encrypted phone calls he used to take, pacing in the garage where he thought I could not hear him. I remembered his sudden desperate need to force me out of the house and seize my assets during the mediation. DeAndre was not just a cheating husband making terrible financial choices to support a mistress. He was embezzling on a massive corporate scale. He had set up dummy vendor accounts and was routing corporate funds through fake invoices to offshore holdings. And Vanessa, in her desperate, arrogant stupidity, had just handed me the exact timeline of his final massive heist. He was planning to move the bulk of the stolen money next week before the quarterly audits caught up with him. I looked down at the bank statement still resting on the glass table. DeAndre thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he had made the fatal mistake of threatening a woman who built digital fortresses for a living. I picked up the paper, smoothed it out, and walked back to my office. It was time to make a phone call to the federal authorities and ruin his entire life. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sounds of DeAndre's frantic pleading. I rode down to the lobby in total silence, feeling a profound sense of closure. DeAndre had wanted a war, but he had brought a butter knife to a nuclear launch site. I walked out of the glass building and into the bright Atlanta afternoon, the warm sun feeling like a victory lap against my skin. The embezzlement file was out of my hands now, and the authorities would meticulously dismantle whatever pathetic remnants of his life still existed. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was swift and absolute. Caldwell did not just fire DeAndre. He initiated a full corporate lockdown and cooperated entirely with the federal investigation. The FBI raided DeAndre's rented condo, confiscating his computers, his files, and the luxury vehicles he had parked out front. Vanessa had panicked the moment the agents knocked on the door, grabbing her fake Chanel bag and fleeing to her mother's house in Florida, leaving DeAndre to face the consequences completely alone. Without access to the stolen funds, DeAndre could not afford the flashy lawyer he had hired for our mediation. Sterling dropped him as a client the second his retainer check bounced, leaving DeAndre to rely on an overworked public defender who advised him to take whatever plea deal the prosecutors offered. The divorce proceedings, which he had threatened to drag out for years, were finalized in record time. The judge took one look at his frozen assets, his federal indictment, and the undeniable proof of his infidelity, and granted me everything I requested. I retained full ownership of my house, full equity in Aegis Cyber, and sole physical custody of Leo. DeAndre was granted supervised visitation rights that he would likely never use from inside a minimum security prison cell. But the destruction of DeAndre was only one part of the equation. Shirley still needed to face the reality she had so desperately tried to ignore. The mega-church fundraising gala was supposed to be Shirley's crowning social achievement of the year. Instead, it became the graveyard of her illusions. The morning after the gala, Jamal's boutique lending firm, Loan, officially defaulted. My corporate financial team, operating precisely within the legal bounds of our acquisition protocol, initiated the standard asset seizure process for delinquent high-yield loans. Jamal and Becky were sitting in their leased McMansion when the repo men arrived to collect the silver Mercedes. Becky had completely dissolved into hysterics, screaming at the tow truck drivers while her neighbors watched from their manicured lawns. Jamal, too exhausted from his secret warehouse night shifts, to even fight back, simply handed over the keys. Shirley was forced to watch her golden child, the supposed senior manager, get exposed as a fraud. The church congregation, which thrived on gossip and social maneuvering, quickly learned the truth about Becky's fake old money background and Jamal's insurmountable debt. Shirley lost her position on the church fundraising committee, replaced by a woman who actually had the funds to contribute rather than just the illusion of them. The last time I saw Shirley was at the final divorce hearing. She sat in the back of the courtroom wearing a faded suit, her extravagant hats nowhere to be seen. She looked small and incredibly tired. When the judge struck the gavel, finalizing my absolute victory, she did not look at me. She simply kept her head down, mourning the total collapse of the fantasy world she had forced her sons to build. I walked out of the courthouse holding Mrs. Higgins' arm. We had stopped by to sign some final paperwork regarding Leo's childcare trust. The Atlanta air was crisp and clear. I looked at the legal documents in my hand, confirming that my company, my home, and my son were permanently protected from the parasites who had tried to drain us. I drove back to my house, pulling into the driveway and smiling at the heavy oak front door. The smart lock glowed a steady, reassuring blue. Inside the house was quiet and peaceful. Leo was napping in his nursery, and the faint smell of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen. I walked into my home office and sat down at my desk. My monitors hummed to life, displaying the complex global networks I protected every single day. I had spent 4 years believing I needed to make myself smaller to fit into a marriage that was built on a foundation of lies. I had tolerated the disrespect, the microaggressions, and the blatant theft because I thought it was the price of keeping a family together. But lying on that floor in active labor, watching DeAndre step over me to cater to his mistress, had been the ultimate awakening. They thought I was just a minor consultant. They thought my success was a hobby. They thought my boundaries were suggestions they could casually ignore. They severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with. I pulled up a new security protocol for a federal client, my fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced precision. The company was expanding, and my profit margins were breaking new records. I was not just a survivor of their toxic family dynamic. I was the architect of my own empire. And as I looked at the sleeping monitor displaying my son's peaceful face, I knew I had built a fortress so strong that no one would ever be able to lock us out again. The dust from the corporate board meeting had barely settled before the true collapse of my former family began. DeAndre had walked into that high-rise office, expecting to watch me lose my largest client. He had expected to see me humiliated and ruined. Instead, he watched his own boss turn the color of chalk as my forensic audit laid bare every single stolen dollar, every ghost vendor, and every fraudulent transfer he had executed over the past 2 years. The FBI had moved with terrifying speed. By the time DeAndre made it back to his car, his company access was revoked. His corporate phone was wiped remotely, and federal agents were already waiting at his office to seize his physical hard drives. It had been exactly 3 days since that meeting. 3 days of absolute silence from DeAndre, while the local news channels started running vague stories about a major embezzlement scandal at a regional supply chain firm. I was sitting in my living room, holding baby Leo against my chest. The morning sun was pouring through the large windows, casting a warm golden glow across the hardwood floors. The house was completely peaceful. It was a fortress of my own making, and for the first time in my life, I felt entirely safe. Leo was sleeping soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. I was gently rocking him when the aggressive pounding started at the front door. It was not a polite knock. It was a frantic, desperate hammering that rattled the heavy oak frame. I did not flinch. I simply stood up, shifting Leo securely into my left arm, and walked slowly toward the foyer. I checked the security monitor mounted on the wall. Shirley was standing on my porch. She looked nothing like the haughty, judgmental woman who had tried to evict me just weeks ago. Her signature lavender church hat was missing. Her hair was unkempt and flattened on one side. She wore a wrinkled trench coat over sweatpants, looking as though she had slept in her clothes. Her hands were shaking violently as she pounded on the wood again. I disabled the alarm and pulled the door open. The cool morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Shirley almost fell forward into the entryway when the door gave way. She caught herself on the doorframe, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She looked frantically at me, and then at the baby in my arms. "Corinne, you have to help us," Shirley gasped, her voice hoarse and broken. "You have to do something right now." "They took him. They took my boy." I stood perfectly still, blocking the doorway so she could not step fully inside my home. I kept my face completely devoid of emotion. "Who took him, Shirley?" I asked, my voice low and steady to avoid waking my son. "The federal agents." Shirley sobbed, gripping the edge of the doorframe so hard her knuckles turned white. "They came to his condo at dawn. They put him in handcuffs, Corinne. They dragged him out in front of the whole street. His company suspended him without pay, pending a criminal investigation. They froze the meager accounts he had left. He has nothing. He cannot even afford a public defender, let alone the kind of legal team he needs to fight the federal government." She paused to wipe a stream of tears from her face, smearing her leftover mascara across her cheek. Her eyes darted to the baby again, and her expression shifted into a mask of desperate pleading. "You are a millionaire," Corinne, Shirley cried, stepping closer to me. "You have a military-grade cybersecurity firm. You have more money than God. You have to hire him a defense attorney. You have to pay his bail. He is the father of your child, Corinne. You must protect the Black family. You cannot let your son's father rot in a federal prison while you sit up here in this mansion." I looked at this woman who had spent 4 years treating me like a disease. This was the same woman who had laughed on the phone with Becky while I was bleeding and begging for help on my way to the emergency room. This was the woman who had demanded I surrender my house to her cheating son. And now, because the illusion of her perfect family was shattered, she dared to stand on my porch and use my infant son as a bargaining chip to access my wealth. I adjusted Leo in my arms, making sure his head was comfortably supported. I looked at Shirley and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, detached pity. "You do not care about the family, Shirley," I said, my words dropping into the quiet morning air like heavy stones. "You have never cared about this family or this baby. You care about the church choir. You care about the Sunday service gossip. You care about the other deaconesses finding out that your absolute king of a son is nothing but a common corporate thief. You are terrified that your entire social standing is about to evaporate when the congregation realizes your perfect boy is a federal criminal." Shirley opened her mouth to protest, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "That is not true," she stammered, reaching out toward me. "I love my son. I love my grandson." "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice slicing through her lies. "And do not pretend you care about my son. The only thing breaking your heart right now is that the illusion is gone. Your son is ruined, and your precious old money white daughter-in-law is a broke, pathetic fraud." Shirley froze her hand, dropping back to her side. Her eyes widened in confusion. "Leave Becky out of this," she whispered defensively. "Becky comes from a good family. Becky knows family values. She is standing by Jamal through all of this stress, unlike you." I let out a short, humorless laugh. I reached into the deep pocket of my cardigan with my free hand. I had printed the documents an hour ago, knowing Shirley would eventually show up begging for salvation. I pulled out a thick, folded stack of legal papers bound by a heavy metal clip. I extended my arm and held the papers out to her. Shirley stared at the documents as if they were a live explosive. She slowly reached out and took them, her hands trembling so badly the paper rustled loudly in the quiet foyer. "What is this?" she asked, looking down at the bold black lettering on the first page. "That is a formal notice of foreclosure," I explained, watching her eyes scan the legal text. "Because Jamal defaulted on his massive personal loans to keep Becky draped in diamonds, my financial firm is legally seizing their property. Your oldest son has not paid his mortgage in 4 months, Shirley. He has not paid the predatory loans he took out from my boutique lending firm. The bank is taking the house today. In fact, the sheriff's deputies are probably pulling up to their driveway right about now to change the locks." Shirley shook her head violently, backing away from me. "No, no, that is impossible," she gasped, clutching the papers to her chest. "Jamal makes good money. Becky has her family trust. They are rich, Corinne. You are just making this up to hurt me." I stepped out onto the porch, the cool air wrapping around me as I systematically dismantled the last pillar of her reality. "Becky has absolutely nothing," I said, staring directly into Shirley's panicked eyes. "Her family went bankrupt years ago. There is no trust fund. There is no generational wealth. She is a small-town girl who learned how to fake an accent and buy knockoff designer bags. And Jamal was so desperate to please you and keep up the image of success that he destroyed his own life to fund her delusion." Shirley let out a small wounded noise, covering her mouth with her hand. "He has been working night shifts at a logistics warehouse loading heavy freight boxes from midnight until dawn, just to make the minimum payments on her fake lifestyle." I continued, refusing to let her look away. "He destroyed his health and his credit, so you could parade Becky around your church gala and brag about her breeding. And do you want to know the best part, Shirley? Do you want to know what your loyal daughter-in-law did when the repo men took her silver Mercedes 3 days ago?" Shirley was openly weeping now, her shoulders shaking as the truth crushed the breath out of her lungs. "Becky packed her bags," I said, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "She packed all those clothes Jamal bought her, and she called a cab to take her to the airport. She fled back to Ohio the moment the money ran out. She left your son alone in an empty house with $500,000 of unpayable debt. She abandoned him just like DeAndre abandoned me." Shirley let out a loud, agonizing wail. Her knees buckled completely, giving out beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard concrete of my front porch, her wrinkled trench coat pooling around her. She dropped the foreclosure notice, the papers scattering across the welcome mat in the morning breeze. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, rocking back and forth on the ground. "My family is destroyed," Shirley wailed, her voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. "You destroyed us, Corinne. You ruined my boys. My entire family is gone." I looked down at the broken woman weeping on my doorstep. I held my son a little closer, feeling his warm, steady heartbeat against my chest. He stirred slightly in his sleep, completely safe and entirely protected from the toxic wasteland of the people who shared his blood. "I did not destroy your family, Shirley," I said, looking down at her shaking form. "Your family was destroyed the exact day your son left me bleeding in a pool of my own amniotic fluid so he could fly his mistress to a fertility clinic. Your family was destroyed when you decided image mattered more than humanity. I just handed you the bill." Shirley continued to sob, her hands clutching at the concrete, refusing to look up at me. The neighborhood remained quiet, the surrounding houses blissfully unaware of the absolute devastation taking place on my porch. I took a step back, moving inside the foyer and preparing to close the heavy oak door. I looked at Shirley one last time, feeling a profound sense of finality wash over my entire being. "By the way, Shirley," I added casually, my hand resting on the brass door handle, "if you happen to speak to DeAndre through the prison phone system today, tell him his country club membership just got revoked. They do not take kindly to federal indictments." I pulled the door shut, hearing the heavy deadbolt slide firmly into place, locking the destruction outside where it belonged. It was time to make a phone call to the federal authorities and ruin his entire life. I did not pick up the phone immediately, because destroying a man like DeAndre required absolute precision. I spent the entire weekend locked inside my home office, pulling every single thread of digital evidence I could find on his corporate networks. As the chief executive officer of Aegis Cyber, I had backdoor administrative clearance to monitor the supply chain software used by Horizon Global Logistics, which happened to be the massive parent company of DeAndre's regional firm. My automated threat assessment protocols had flagged anomalous routing numbers months ago, but I had ignored them as standard corporate tax sheltering. Now I looked closer, and the sheer arrogance of his operation was almost insulting. He had set up 3 dummy logistics vendors registered to a single post office box in Delaware. He was using his administrative credentials to approve emergency freight invoices for shipments that never existed. The money was being funneled directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Over the past 2 years, he had embezzled more than $1.5 million from his own employers. I traced the digital footprints and found that his money trail was laughably simple to follow. He had created the first ghost vendor, Apex Freight Solutions, 2 years ago, right around the time he started sleeping with Vanessa. He used it to siphon small amounts, at first just $5,000 here and there to pay for their hotel rooms and expensive dinners. But as his greed grew, so did his audacity. He created Global Transit Partners and Vertex Shipping to move much larger sums. He used the stolen corporate funds to buy Vanessa her diamond tennis bracelets, her designer bags, and eventually her elite in vitro fertilization treatments. He was essentially forcing Horizon Global Logistics to finance his entire infidelity. I documented every single transaction, cross-referencing the corporate payouts with deposits into his offshore accounts. I compiled every timestamp, every fraudulent approval code, and every hidden routing number into a massive encrypted dossier. I built a timeline so precise it left zero room for deniability. On Monday morning, my phone began vibrating frantically with alerts from my public relations team. DeAndre had decided that a preemptive strike was his best chance at survival. He published a massive sprawling post on LinkedIn, portraying himself as a brave whistleblower. He wrote a tragic, entirely fabricated story about how his bitter, jealous ex-wife was using her cybersecurity firm to conduct illegal hacking and unauthorized surveillance to destroy Black families. He played the victim perfectly, knowing the internet loved a dramatic sob story. He claimed my firm was a rogue operation completely devoid of ethics. And to inflict maximum damage, he specifically tagged Horizon Global Logistics, demanding they terminate their multi-million-dollar contract with my company immediately. He thought he was a mastermind playing corporate chess while I was stuck playing checkers. He actually believed his little social media stunt would force me into bankruptcy before I could expose his stolen college funds. The backlash was immediate. Richard Vance, the chief executive officer of Horizon Global, called me personally before 9 in the morning. He was a ruthless man who protected his corporate data with an iron fist. He demanded my presence at an emergency board meeting that afternoon, stating that allegations of unethical hacking from one of his own regional managers required immediate investigation. I did not argue or attempt to defend myself over the phone. I simply agreed to be at their downtown headquarters by 2 o'clock. I slipped the encrypted flash drive containing DeAndre's complete forensic audit into my jacket pocket and smiled. The Horizon Global Boardroom was an intimidating expanse of glass and polished mahogany located on the 50th floor overlooking the entire city. When I walked through the double doors projecting absolute calm, the tension in the room was suffocating. Richard Vance sat at the head of the long table, flanked by his grim-faced board of directors. Sitting near the end of the table, looking incredibly smug and victorious, was DeAndre. He wore a cheap suit he thought looked expensive, and he leaned back in his plush leather chair twirling a pen. He had somehow convinced his superiors to let him attend the meeting as the star witness against my supposed corporate espionage. Sitting directly next to him was his regional director, a strict, no-nonsense man named Arthur Caldwell, who looked annoyed to even be dealing with this situation. "Thank you for coming, Corinne," Richard Vance said, his voice echoing sharply in the large, sterile room. "We pride ourselves on the integrity of our security vendors. This morning, your ex-husband came to us with very serious public allegations. He claims you are using Aegis cyber resources to illegally hack private citizens and conduct unauthorized surveillance. He believes you are a massive liability to our corporate data and recommends we terminate your contract immediately." DeAndre sat forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He looked around the table, playing the role of the deeply concerned corporate citizen perfectly. "It is a matter of public safety. Gentlemen," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "Corinne is a bitter woman going through a very difficult divorce. She is using military-grade hacking tools to ruin my life and terrorize my new partner. If she is willing to illegally breach my personal home networks, just imagine what she is doing with your classified corporate data. She is unstable, and her firm needs to be investigated by federal authorities immediately." He smiled at me across the massive table. It was a cold, arrogant smile. He thought he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He believed I would have to desperately defend my character and my company policies to save my most lucrative contract. He thought I would beg. I did not say a single word in my defense. I simply opened my sleek silver laptop and connected it to the main presentation monitor mounted on the wall behind the chief executive officer. The massive screen flickered to life, displaying a stark white background covered in hundreds of lines of highlighted financial data. "I appreciate your concern for your corporate data, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and conversational. "And as your primary cybersecurity vendor, it is my job to constantly monitor your networks for internal vulnerabilities." When DeAndre launched his public smear campaign this morning, my automated threat assessment protocols flagged him as a hostile entity interacting with your regional systems. So I initiated a standard forensic audit on his specific supply chain sector. DeAndre frowned slightly, his smug smile faltering just a fraction. He shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, clearly not understanding what was happening yet. I clicked my mouse, bringing up a series of highly detailed spreadsheets and digital invoices. "I did not find any vulnerabilities in your external firewalls, Richard." I continued, looking directly at the chief executive officer. "But I did find something incredibly interesting inside DeAndre's departmental operating budget." I highlighted a column of vendor names on the screen, ensuring everyone at the table could read them clearly. "Over the past 24 months, your regional supply chain manager has approved over 400 separate invoices to 3 different logistics vendors," I said, pointing to the screen. "Apex Freight Solutions, Global Transit Partners, and Vertex Shipping. DeAndre has been routing approximately $60,000 a month to these 3 companies for supposed emergency freight transportation." Arthur Caldwell, DeAndre's boss, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses and squinting at the glowing screen. "Those are approved emergency vendors," Arthur Caldwell said, sounding defensive and confused. "DeAndre manages our overflow shipping contracts." "They are not vendors, Arthur," I replied coldly. "They do not exist. There are no trucks. There are no warehouses. There is no freight being moved. They are ghost entities registered to a single post office box in Delaware. And the routing numbers attached to every single one of those paid invoices lead directly to an offshore holding account in the Cayman Islands. An account that was opened 2 years ago using DeAndre's exact social security number and his corporate verification credentials." The boardroom went completely dead silent. It was the kind of heavy, absolute silence that feels like the air is being sucked out of the room. Richard Vance stared at the screen, his eyes tracing the red highlighted lines, showing over $1.5 million systematically drained from his own company. Arthur Caldwell turned ghostly white. The blood completely left his face as the realization hit him that his own direct subordinate had been robbing his department blind for 2 years, right under his nose. His hands began to shake as he looked at the undeniable digital proof displayed on the massive monitor. He looked at DeAndre as if he were looking at a complete stranger. DeAndre was frozen in his chair. The arrogant, victorious smile had been entirely wiped from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the inevitable click. He began to sweat profusely, a thick bead of moisture rolling down his forehead and soaking into his cheap collar. "This is a lie," DeAndre stammered, his voice cracking and pitching upward in absolute panic. "She is hacking. She is framing me. She fabricated these documents because she is angry about the divorce. You cannot believe her. This is illegal retaliation." He stood up, pushing his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed loudly onto the carpeted floor. He pointed a shaking finger at the monitor, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "She hacked the mainframe," DeAndre shouted, his eyes darting wildly around the room. "She planted those vendor names. She is a criminal. You have to arrest her right now." I closed my laptop with a soft, satisfying click. The screen behind Richard Vance went dark, instantly cutting off the glaring evidence of DeAndre's destroyed life. I stood up and smoothed the front of my tailored suit. I looked at DeAndre, my expression one of absolute utter pity. "I did not hack anything, DeAndre," I said, my voice dropping to a clinical detached whisper that carried perfectly across the quiet room. "You do not need to hack a system when the regional manager logs into the corporate financial portal from his home Wi-Fi network every Sunday night. And you certainly do not need military-grade hacking tools when the regional manager's master administrative password is simply Vanessa2024. DeAndre stopped breathing entirely. His mouth hung open, a silent scream trapped in his throat. He looked around the boardroom, searching desperately for a single face that believed his pathetic lies, but all he found were wealthy, powerful men staring at him with absolute disgust and legal fury. The reality of his impending imprisonment was crashing down on him in real time. I picked up my laptop and my leather portfolio. I looked at Richard Vance, who was already reaching for his desk phone to call the corporate legal team and building security. "I will leave you gentlemen to chat," I said, giving the board a polite, professional nod. "The full, unredacted forensic report is on the flash drive I left on your desk, Richard. And just as a professional courtesy, you should know that my firm has already forwarded the entire encrypted file to the local field office of the FBI. They should be arriving at your regional headquarters any minute now." I turned and walked out of the boardroom, the heavy glass doors closing softly behind me, sealing DeAndre inside his own personal hell. I walked away from the front door, leaving Shirley to her tears, and returned to the quiet sanctuary of my home office. The digital alerts on my monitors were already painting a very clear picture of DeAndre's desperate final moves. A rational man facing a federal embezzlement investigation would contact a defense attorney and prepare for the inevitable. But DeAndre was not a rational man, and Vanessa was a parasite who only cared about appearances. Despite knowing the FBI had seized his corporate hard drives and his accounts were completely frozen, DeAndre was still trying to play the role of the wealthy executive. My security algorithms flagged a massive charge on his remaining secondary corporate credit card. $50,000 had just been authorized to the Whispering Pines Country Club. It was the most exclusive and ridiculously expensive venue in the entire Atlanta metropolitan area. Vanessa had apparently convinced him to proceed with their lavish engagement and baby reveal party. She wanted her moment in the spotlight, regardless of the fact that the money funding it was entirely stolen. DeAndre, in his absolute delusion, had agreed to host the party. My surveillance protocols indicated he had also booked a one-way international flight to a non-extradition country for the following morning. He actually believed he could throw a massive celebration tonight and simply slip away into the shadows tomorrow, leaving everyone else to clean up his mess. He thought he could outrun the federal government while simultaneously paying for a ridiculous party. What DeAndre did not know was that my corporate umbrella had been quietly acquiring real estate holding companies across the state for the past 2 years. Whispering Pines Country Club had been struggling with bad management and massive debt for a long time. My investment firm had purchased the majority shares of the club just 3 weeks prior to secure their prime real estate assets. I literally owned the very ground DeAndre was standing on. I owned the grand ballroom he had rented. I owned the catering staff pouring his expensive champagne. He was throwing a party to celebrate his fake new life in a building that belonged entirely to the woman he had abandoned. It was a level of poetic justice that was simply too perfect to ignore. I decided it was time to attend the celebration and watch the grand finale in person. I walked into my large dressing room and bypassed the neutral business suites I usually wore to corporate meetings. Tonight required something entirely different. I selected a custom-tailored crimson silk suit. The color was sharp and vibrant, projecting absolute power and undeniable authority. I paired it with simple stiletto heels and swept my hair back into a sleek, completely flawless style. I did not need heavy jewelry or flashy accessories. True power does not need to sparkle to be felt in a room. I called Marcus and instructed him to meet me at the venue with two of our top private security contractors. I was going to deliver the final blow to DeAndre's crumbling empire in front of every single person he was trying to impress. I sat in the back of my black SUV as my driver navigated through the evening traffic toward the wealthy suburbs. I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows, feeling a profound sense of calm. The chaotic years of dealing with Shirley's constant disrespect and DeAndre's financial manipulation were finally coming to a complete and permanent end. When my vehicle pulled up to the grand entrance of the country club, the parking lot was already full of luxury cars. I stepped out into the warm evening air, flanked by Marcus and another towering security guard named David. We walked past the valet stand and approached the massive heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom. Through the thick wood, I could hear the pulsing beat of a live band and the collective chatter of hundreds of guests. DeAndre had clearly spared no stolen expense for this ridiculous charade. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside, taking in the grotesque display of completely fraudulent wealth. The room was draped in white silk and massive gold floral arrangements. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne and tiny caviar appetizers. An elaborate ice sculpture shaped like a baby pacifier sat in the center of the room, slowly melting under the warm chandelier lights. The guests were a mixture of Vanessa's shallow socialite friends and DeAndre's clueless business acquaintances who had not yet seen the evening news about the impending federal raids. I scanned the crowded room and immediately spotted the remnants of my former family. Despite weeping on my concrete porch just hours earlier, Shirley was standing near the main stage, holding a glass of sparkling water. She was wearing a brand new silver gown and a massive matching hat that looked absurdly out of place for an evening event. Her smile was tight and forced her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was terrified that someone would mention the embezzlement rumors or the foreclosure notices, but she was too obsessed with her social standing to skip the event. She was standing on the deck of a sinking ship, pretending the water rising around her ankles was just a warm bath. Across the room, slumped over the polished mahogany bar, was Jamal. He was still wearing the wrinkled clothes from the day before, looking completely disheveled and deeply intoxicated. Becky had fled to Ohio, leaving him with a foreclosed home and $500,000 of unpayable debt. He was downing dark liquor at a rapid pace, trying to numb the reality that his entire life was a lie built to please his mother. People were intentionally keeping their distance from him, whispering behind their hands. He looked pathetic and completely broken. And then there was Vanessa. She was holding court near a massive tiered cake, wearing a skin-tight white gown that prominently displayed her baby bump. She was laughing loudly, throwing her head back and extending her left hand to make sure everyone saw the heavy diamond engagement ring resting on her finger. The stones caught the light, casting bright reflections across the faces of her envious friends. She was soaking up the attention, completely oblivious to the fact that the man she was bragging about was an indicted criminal preparing to flee the country without her. I could hear her shrill voice carrying over the music, telling a group of women that DeAndre was a true provider and a real king who knew how to treat a queen. She boasted about the tropical vacations they were planning, and the massive custom nursery they were designing for the baby. She told them the diamond was flawless and custom sourced from Europe. She was entirely wrapped in her own delusion, convinced that she had won the ultimate prize by stealing a husband who was actually nothing more than a desperate thief running out of time. I stepped fully into the ballroom, Marcus and David stepping in perfectly right behind me. My crimson suit stood out like a beacon against the sea of pastel dresses and dark tuxedos. The guests standing near the doors noticed me first. Their conversations stopped abruptly, their eyes widening as they recognized the ex-wife walking into the engagement party. The silence rippled outward, spreading through the crowd like a drop of ink in a glass of water. The live band faltered and stopped playing as the lead singer noticed the commotion. The human noise in the room rapidly died down until there was nothing but tense, expectant quiet. The sea of guests slowly parted, creating a wide, clear path directly from the entrance to the center of the room where DeAndre and Vanessa were standing. DeAndre had a glass of expensive scotch in his hand, and he was smiling at something Vanessa had just said. He turned his head, noticing the sudden hush in the room, and his eyes locked onto mine. The color immediately drained from DeAndre's face, leaving his skin a sickly grayish hue. His hand shook slightly, causing the amber liquid in his glass to slosh against the rim and spill onto his expensive shoes. He looked at my sharp crimson suit and the two massive security guards flanking me. For a brief second, I saw genuine naked fear in his eyes. He knew what I was capable of, and he knew I would not be here unless I held all the cards. But DeAndre was a narcissist surrounded by his audience, and his fragile ego demanded that he perform. He could not look weak in front of Vanessa and his friends. He handed his drink to a passing waiter and threw his shoulders back, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of fake dominance. He marched away from Vanessa and walked directly toward me, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet room. He stopped just a few feet away from me, his face twisted into an ugly mask of fake outrage and entirely unearned confidence. "What are you doing here, Corinne?" DeAndre demanded, his voice loud enough for the entire silent room to hear clearly. "This is a private event. You have absolutely no right to stalk us and ruin this night just because you are bitter. You need to leave right now before I have you arrested for trespassing." I simply looked at him, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of intimidation or anger. I just let him continue to dig his own grave in front of 100 witnesses. DeAndre turned his head and shouted toward the back of the room, where the venue staff were standing frozen in shock. "Security! Get this bitter trash out of here right now," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "Call the local police and have her physically removed from my party immediately." The heavy silence in the room stretched for a long, agonizing moment. Murmurs began to break out among the wealthy guests who were absolutely horrified by the tacky display. Shirley covered her mouth with her hand, looking like she might actually pass out right there by the stage. Vanessa stepped forward, crossing her arms over her chest and glaring at me, waiting for the staff to physically throw me out into the street. From the shadows near the kitchen swinging doors, the general manager of the Whispering Pines Country Club stepped forward. Mr. Harrison was a distinguished older man in a pristine tuxedo who had run the club operations for over 2 decades. He walked calmly across the ballroom floor, his polished shoes making absolutely no sound on the thick carpet. DeAndre smirked at me, folding his arms and clearly believing the manager was coming to fulfill his aggressive demands and throw me out. Mr. Harrison reached us and stopped. He did not look at me. He did not signal his security staff to grab my arms or call the police. He turned his entire body and looked directly at DeAndre with an expression of profound professional disgust. "Sir, step away from Miss Corinne," Mr. Harrison said, his voice projecting clearly and calmly across the dead-silent ballroom. "She is the new majority shareholder of this club." The silence that followed Mr. Harrison's statement was heavy and absolute. DeAndre stared at the club manager, his brain completely failing to process the words. The concept that I owned the Whispering Pines Country Club, that I literally owned the ground beneath his expensive shoes, was entirely beyond his comprehension. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the massive table holding their multi-tiered cake. The lavish ice sculpture of a baby pacifier seemed to mock him, dripping slowly onto the white linen tablecloth. The guests were frozen, holding their breath as they watched the illusion of DeAndre's wealth shatter in real time. I did not give him a chance to recover. I walked past his trembling form and stepped directly up to the small elevated stage where the live band had been playing. The musicians quickly parted ways, stepping back as my security guards flanked the stage. I reached out and calmly took the microphone from the hands of the terrified disc jockey. The faint electronic hum of the audio system amplified the absolute quiet in the massive ballroom. "I apologize for crashing the celebration," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the premium speakers. It rolled over the crowd, smooth and entirely devoid of emotion. But I had to deliver a wedding gift in person. I raised my free hand and gave a sharp, deliberate signal to the audio-visual booth located at the back of the room. Mr. Harrison had personally ensured my specific instructions were followed to the letter. Instantly, the ambient lighting dimmed. The soft, romantic glow of the chandeliers faded into darkness. Above the dance floor, 3 massive motorized projector screens slowly descended from the ceiling with a mechanical whirring sound that filled the quiet room. Vanessa stepped forward, a confused but arrogant smile returning to her face. She clearly assumed this was some sort of surprise presentation, perhaps a slideshow of their romantic vacations, or a highly produced video celebrating their fake love story. She wrapped her arms around her baby bump, waiting for the images of her perfect life to appear. The projectors flared to life, flooding the dark ballroom with harsh white light. But instead of a romantic slideshow of Vanessa and DeAndre, the massive screens displayed the cold, hard reality of their entire relationship. In stark, high-definition clarity, the screens displayed DeAndre's offshore bank routing numbers in the Cayman Islands. Right next to them were the fabricated ghost vendor invoices from Apex Freight Solutions and Global Transit Partners. And displayed prominently in the center of the largest screen were the highly detailed medical receipts for Vanessa's elite in vitro fertilization treatments. Every single document was highlighted with bright red boxes, showing how the stolen corporate funds were funneled directly to pay for her extravagant lifestyle. The stark white background of the financial documents illuminated the luxurious white silk draping of the ballroom, turning it into a sterile interrogation room. A collective massive gasp rippled through the hundreds of guests. The sound of wealthy socialites and corporate executives simultaneously realizing they were drinking stolen champagne was almost musical. People began pointing at the screens, their faces twisting in shock and disgust. The whispers started immediately growing into a loud, frantic buzz of outrage. I kept the microphone close to my mouth and turned to look directly at Vanessa. Her arrogant smile had completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her eyes were wide, taking in the irrefutable digital proof of her fraudulent existence. "He did not buy you that diamond with his money, Vanessa," I said, my voice slicing through the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. The entire room fell dead silent again, hanging onto my every word. "He bought it with his employees' pension funds. He bought your clothes, your bags, and your medical treatments with money he stole from the hardworking people at Horizon Global Logistics." Vanessa let out a small, wounded gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. She took a step away from DeAndre, looking at him as if he were covered in a toxic substance. "And that luxurious Miami trip you have been bragging about all night," I continued, showing absolutely zero mercy. "Enjoy the baby, Vanessa. But you should know that the FBI freezes all personal assets connected to federal embezzlement. You have absolutely nothing." Before Vanessa could even process the magnitude of her impending poverty, the loud, piercing wail of multiple sirens shattered the quiet evening air outside the country club. The sound was deafening, echoing across the manicured golf course and vibrating through the floorboards. Bright flashing beams of red and blue light violently pierced through the large stained glass windows of the ballroom, casting frantic, erratic shadows across the terrified faces of the guests. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room did not just open, they were forcefully thrown apart. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with bold yellow lettering reading FBI marched into the ballroom. They moved with terrifying military precision, fanning out to secure the perimeter and sealing every single exit in the massive space. The guests began to panic, shrinking back against the walls, holding their drinks tightly to their chests. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a clipped badge on his belt, walked straight down the center aisle. He did not look at the expensive floral arrangements or the terrified socialites. His eyes were locked entirely on DeAndre. DeAndre began to tremble so violently that he looked like he might collapse. The illusion of the wealthy, successful executive completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a scared, desperate thief caught in a trap of his own making. DeAndre Harrison, the lead agent, said, his voice booming with unquestionable authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and money laundering. Place your hands behind your back immediately." DeAndre let out a pathetic, high-pitched noise, backing away until he hit the edge of the stage. Federal agents were already moving in, pulling pairs of heavy steel handcuffs from their belts. DeAndre looked wildly around the room, searching for any possible escape route, but there was none. Realizing his life was entirely over, he turned his desperate gaze to the woman he had destroyed his family for. "Tell them," baby DeAndre begged, his voice cracking completely as panic consumed his throat. He reached out a shaking hand toward Vanessa, hoping she would play the role of the devoted partner, standing by her man against the world. "Tell them we did not know. Tell them this is all a huge mistake." Vanessa looked at the federal agents and then at DeAndre. Her eyes darted to the flashing red and blue lights reflecting on the silk-draped ceiling. The realization washed over her face, completely erasing any trace of loyalty or love. The money was gone. The tropical vacations were gone. The illusion of the wealthy provider was shattered and replaced by the reality of a federal prison sentence. She looked down at the massive, flawless diamond ring on her left hand, her face twisted into a mask of absolute revulsion and sheer survival instinct. "Get away from me!" Vanessa screamed, her shrill voice echoing across the ballroom. She grabbed the diamond ring and forcefully yanked it off her finger. She threw it directly at DeAndre's chest with all her might. The heavy ring bounced off his suit jacket and clattered onto the polished wooden dance floor, skidding away into the shadows. "I did not know he was a thief," Vanessa yelled frantically, pointing a shaking manicured finger at him. "I am the victim here. He lied to me. He told me he was a successful executive. I had nothing to do with any of this money." She grabbed the heavy skirt of her skin-tight white gown and awkwardly tried to run toward the side patio doors. She shoved past a group of terrified guests, desperate to put as much distance between herself and the sinking ship of DeAndre's life as possible. She was entirely willing to leave the father of her unborn child to face federal charges alone as long as she could save herself. But she did not make it far. A female federal agent stepped smoothly into her path, completely blocking the exit. "Excuse me, ma'am," the female agent said, holding up a hand to stop Vanessa's frantic escape. Vanessa tried to push past her, claiming she was pregnant and needed to leave the premises immediately for her health. The agent did not budge an inch. "Ma'am, you are a co-signer on the offshore accounts," the female agent said. Her voice completely flat and professional, slicing through Vanessa's hysterical protests. The entire ballroom watched in stunned, morbid fascination. "The offshore routing documents clearly list your legal signature. You are coming with us too." Vanessa let out an ear-piercing shriek of pure horror. She collapsed onto her knees, sobbing uncontrollably and screaming that she was innocent. She wailed that DeAndre had tricked her into signing the paperwork, that she thought they were just standard investment documents. She wept and thrashed, but the female agent remained entirely unmoved. The female agent was completely unfazed by Vanessa's designer gown or her theatrical tears. She grabbed Vanessa's wrists and smoothly locked the steel cuffs around them. The sound of the metal ratcheting tight was sharp and definitive. The glamorous mistress was instantly reduced to a weeping, hysterical suspect in front of all her elite friends. Near the stage, Shirley let out a loud, agonizing groan and crumpled to the floor. The stress of watching her oldest son being handcuffed by federal agents while her youngest son sat drunk and ruined at the bar was simply too much for her fragile socialite heart. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing into her brand-new silver gown, completely destroyed by the reality that her entire social standing was dead and buried. Jamal did not even look up from his drink, staring blankly at the polished mahogany wood, completely numb to the chaos erupting around him. The federal agents grabbed DeAndre's arms and roughly forced them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed loudly. DeAndre was breathing heavily, tears streaming down his face, ruining his carefully groomed appearance. As the agents began to lead him toward the front doors, he suddenly dropped his dead weight, forcing the agents to halt. He fell directly to his knees, right in front of where I was standing on the edge of the stage. He looked up at me from the floor, a broken, pathetic shell of a man, humiliated in front of Atlanta's elite. He looked up at me with mucus and tears smearing his face. The expensive cologne he wore could not mask the sharp, acrid scent of his absolute terror. "Corinne, please," DeAndre begged, openly sobbing, now his pride entirely broken. "Please, you have to help me. They are going to take me away. You have the money, Corinne. You have the cyber firm. You own this country club. Please pay for my bail. Hire me a defense attorney. Do not let them lock me in a federal prison. I am sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything I did to you. Please, Corinne, think of Leo. Think of our son. You cannot let Leo's father go to jail." I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor in handcuffs. This was the same man who had left me bleeding on a bathroom floor. This was the man who had stolen our joint savings to fund a secret life with a woman who had just thrown his ring at his face. He had the absolute audacity to invoke the name of the infant son he had abandoned as a bargaining chip to save his own skin. The silence in the ballroom was profound. Hundreds of guests, federal agents, and venue staff waited with bated breath to see how the powerful millionaire ex-wife would respond to this pathetic display of begging. I stared at his tear-stained face and felt absolutely nothing. The love was gone. The anger was gone. The betrayal had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hardened landscape of pure indifference. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I kept my face completely unreadable, a flawless mask of absolute authority. I looked down at DeAndre and spoke my final words to him, dropping them into the silence like heavy stones. "Just grab an Uber, DeAndre," I said, my voice perfectly calm and entirely devoid of sympathy. "The precinct is only 10 minutes away." I did not wait for his reaction. I simply handed the microphone back to the frozen disc jockey and turned my back on him. The swish of my crimson silk suit was the only sound I paid attention to as I began walking toward the grand exit. Marcus and David immediately fell into step right behind me, ensuring my path was clear through the parted sea of stunned guests. Behind me, the ballroom erupted into total chaos. DeAndre began screaming my name, thrashing against the federal agents as they forcibly dragged him up from the floor. "Corinne!" he wailed, his voice tearing through the room with absolute agony. "Corinne! Please do not leave me." "Corinne." I did not look back. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped out into the cool evening air. The night sky was clear and vast. I walked to my waiting vehicle, leaving the flashing red and blue lights, the sobbing mistresses, the ruined families, and the shattered illusions exactly where they belonged, entirely in my past. 3 months had passed since that chaotic night at the country club. 3 months since the flashing blue and red lights had reflected off the pristine glass windows of the grand ballroom and signaled the absolute termination of DeAndre Harrison's arrogant existence. The local news channels and regional corporate blogs had absolutely feasted on the scandal. The story of a regional supply chain manager embezzling over $1 million to fund a lavish double life with his mistress was too scandalous for the media to ignore. Reporters had dug up every single detail of the fraudulent ghost vendors, the offshore accounts, and the pathetic attempts to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. My name was entirely kept out of the press as I had legally secured whistleblower anonymity through my corporate attorneys. To the public eye, DeAndre had simply flown too close to the sun, and his own sloppy accounting had triggered an internal federal audit. The federal trial was incredibly swift and utterly devoid of any dignity. I did not attend the proceedings in person, but my legal team provided me with daily transcripts of the absolute circus taking place in the courtroom. DeAndre and Vanessa had immediately turned on each other the very second they realized the severity of the federal charges. The loyalty they had paraded around the country club evaporated the moment they were facing a decade in a concrete cell. Vanessa's defense attorney tried to paint her as a naive, tragic victim who had been completely manipulated by an older, wealthy man. She sat on the witness stand weeping without tears, claiming she thought the offshore accounts were standard corporate tax shelters. She swore she had no idea the diamonds, the vacations, and the fertility treatments were paid for with stolen pension funds. DeAndre was equally pathetic. He cried openly during his testimony, blaming the intense pressure of corporate America and claiming he only stole the money because Vanessa was incredibly demanding and materialistic. He told the judge he was just trying to provide for his new family and begged for leniency, citing his lack of prior criminal history. The federal judge, a stern woman who had zero patience for corporate thieves, was completely unmoved by their theatrical sobbing. The digital forensic evidence I had handed over was absolutely bulletproof. There was no reasonable doubt. There was only a clear documented trail of extreme greed and absolute arrogance. When the gavel finally fell, the sound echoed like a gunshot, marking the end of their lives as they knew them. DeAndre and Vanessa were both sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for multiple counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and corporate embezzlement. There was no chance for early parole. All of their remaining assets were seized by the federal government. The luxury cars were repossessed. The designer clothes and diamond jewelry were confiscated to be auctioned off to repay Horizon Global Logistics. Vanessa was forced to give birth to her child while in federal custody, the baby immediately being placed into the foster care system because her own family refused to take the child of a convicted felon. DeAndre was sent to a maximum security facility in another state, stripped of his tailored suits and his country club memberships, reduced to nothing but an inmate number stamped on a generic khaki uniform. The destruction of my ex-husband's life was total. But the collateral damage inflicted upon his toxic family was perhaps even more poetic. Shirley had built her entire identity on the illusion of her perfect, successful sons. Her status in her church community and her social circles was the only thing that gave her empty life any meaning. When the embezzlement scandal broke, her social standing evaporated overnight. The same church congregation that had once listened to her brag about DeAndre's wealth and Becky's breeding suddenly turned their backs on her entirely. The deaconesses whispered behind their hands when she walked into the sanctuary. The pastor politely asked her to step down from her leadership committees, citing the negative media attention surrounding her family. Shirley could not handle the sheer humiliation of being a social outcast. She stopped wearing her extravagant lavender church hats. She stopped attending the Sunday services. She locked herself inside her house until the bank finally arrived to enforce the foreclosure notices I had served her. Because Jamal had defaulted on the massive predatory loans he took out from my boutique lending firm, the bank seized the property completely. Shirley was physically evicted from the comfortable suburban home she had lived in for decades. She was forced to pack her belongings into cheap cardboard boxes and move into a tiny, dingy 2-bedroom apartment in a decaying building on the far side of town. She did not make that move alone. Jamal was forced to move into the cramped apartment with her. His life had been entirely dismantled by his own desperate need to impress a woman who never actually loved him. Becky had officially filed for divorce from Ohio, serving him with the papers through the mail. She completely abandoned him, leaving him solely responsible for the $500,000 of toxic debt he had accumulated to buy her designer bags and silver Mercedes. Jamal was a broken, hollow shell of a man. He lost his mid-level corporate job due to the massive public scandal surrounding his brother. No respectable firm in the city would hire someone with the last name Harrison. He spent his days sitting on a stained hand-me-down couch in that tiny apartment drinking cheap liquor and staring blankly at the wall. Oh. The perfect Harrison family legacy had been reduced to two miserable people trapped in a decaying apartment, drowning in debt and entirely isolated from the world they used to rule. While their world burned to ash, my empire was soaring to heights I had previously only dreamed of. I was sitting in my sleek, high-tech corner office at the very top of the Aegis Cyber headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a panoramic view of the bustling city below, a city where I was no longer a victim, but a recognized titan of industry. The room hummed with the quiet, efficient energy of elite success. My desk was a massive slab of polished black marble, perfectly organized and devoid of clutter. I was holding a heavy gold fountain pen, staring down at a stack of thick legal documents bound in heavy leather folders. The complete destruction of DeAndre's embezzlement ring had inadvertently become the greatest marketing campaign my company could have ever asked for. When the federal authorities reviewed the forensic audit I had provided, they were absolutely astounded by the precision, the speed, and the unbreakable architecture of my threat assessment protocols. Aegis Cyber had essentially handed the FBI a perfectly wrapped conviction on a silver platter. Word of our capabilities spread rapidly through the highest levels of the federal government. My firm went from being a highly respected corporate vendor to an absolute necessity for national security infrastructure. I clicked the cap off the gold pen and smoothly signed my name on the final line of the contract resting on my desk. It was a massive multi-year exclusive contract with the Department of Defense. My company had just been officially retained to overhaul the cybersecurity architecture for the regional Federal Reserve Network. It was a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It was the kind of generational wealth that permanently altered the trajectory of a family bloodline. I set the pen down and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, letting out a long, slow breath. I had done it. I had survived the worst betrayal imaginable, and I had weaponized that pain into an unbreakable fortress of success. I was respected by the most powerful men in the country. I was deeply feared by my competitors, and most importantly, I was completely and entirely untouchable. I packed my laptop into my leather briefcase and walked out of my corner office. My employees gave me polite, respectful nods as I walked past the rows of glowing server stations and active monitoring terminals. There was no toxic gossip here. There was no disrespect. There was only loyalty and a shared mission of absolute excellence. I took the private elevator down to the secure underground parking garage, where my driver was already waiting with the door of my black SUV open. The drive home was peaceful. I watched the city skyline fade into the lush green canopy of the wealthy suburbs. I did not live in the same house where DeAndre had left me bleeding on the floor. I had sold that property months ago and purchased a massive gated estate completely surrounded by ancient oak trees and state-of-the-art security protocols. As my vehicle approached the heavy wrought iron gates, they swung open silently, recognizing my secure digital credentials. The tires crunched softly against the pristine white gravel of the long, winding driveway. I stepped out of the SUV and walked through the grand entryway of my home. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lavender and vanilla. I dropped my keys into the silver bowl by the door and kicked off my heels, feeling the soft plushness of the expensive carpet beneath my bare feet. I walked through the large open-concept kitchen, taking a moment to appreciate the absolute silence of a house that belonged entirely to me. There was no anxiety here. There were no lies hiding in the shadows. There was only peace. I walked toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the backyard. The afternoon sun was shining brightly, casting a warm golden glow across the perfectly manicured green lawn. I pushed the doors open and stepped out onto the stone patio, the gentle summer breeze brushing against my face. Near the center of the expansive lawn, sitting on a large red and white checkered picnic blanket, was Mrs. Higgins. The elderly neighbor who had rushed to my side when my water broke, who had held my hand in the hospital when my own husband abandoned me, had become a permanent fixture in my life. I had officially hired her as Leo's primary nanny, but she was so much more than that. She was the grandmother my son actually deserved. Mrs. Higgins looked up as I approached, her face breaking into a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She was holding baby Leo, supporting him under his arms as he tried to stand on his unsteady little legs. Leo was wearing a soft cotton onesie, his dark curls catching the sunlight. When he saw me, he let out a loud, joyful squeal, throwing his tiny arms into the air and reaching for me. I dropped to my knees on the soft blanket and scooped my son into my arms, pulling him tightly against my chest. He smelled like baby lotion and fresh air. He buried his face in my neck, his little hands gripping the collar of my silk blouse. I closed my eyes and breathed him in, feeling his small, steady heartbeat syncing with my own. "You are home early," Corinne, Mrs. Higgins, said, her voice soft and full of actual affection. We were just enjoying the sunshine. "He has been a perfect angel all afternoon." I kissed the top of Leo's head, keeping him safely wrapped in my arms. "I finished signing the federal contracts," I said, looking over at the kind older woman. "Everything is officially finalized. We never have to worry about anything ever again." Mrs. Higgins smiled and reached into the woven picnic basket sitting beside her on the grass. She pulled out a small ceramic plate holding a large slice of fresh homemade cherry pie. The sweet smell of baked fruit and warm pastry drifted through the air. She handed the plate to me, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "I baked this morning," she said gently. "I thought we should celebrate. You have fought so hard for this piece, Corinne. You earned every single bit of it." I took the plate, balancing it carefully, while keeping my other arm wrapped securely around my son. I looked out across the expansive green lawn toward the tall, ancient oak trees that lined the edge of my property. The sky above was a brilliant, endless blue, completely devoid of clouds. The world was quiet, safe, and entirely under my control. As I sat there in the warm sunlight holding the child I had almost lost, I felt a profound wave of clarity wash over my entire soul. I thought about Shirley and Jamal, rotting in their cramped apartment, clinging to the ghost of a legacy that never really existed. I thought about DeAndre, locked in a concrete cell, stripped of his pride and his fake wealth. They had destroyed themselves because they believed that image mattered more than integrity. They believed that loyalty was a weakness to be exploited. I looked down at Leo, who was now giggling happily and batting at the edge of the ceramic plate in my hand. I realized in that perfect sunlit moment that true family is not defined by blood or shared last names. Family is defined by the people who stay when the illusion shatters. It is defined by the people who hold your hand in the dark. And I realized that a man's worth is never found in his loud, arrogant pride or his flashy suits. A man's worth is determined by his ability to protect the people he claims to love. DeAndre had none of that worth, and so he ended up with exactly what he deserved: absolute nothingness. I had learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of my life. True, enduring peace cannot be given to you by a partner or a parent. True peace is built on a foundation of absolute financial and emotional independence. It is forged in the fires of survival and secured by your own two hands. I did not need a king to build an empire. I was the architect of my own salvation. Leo let out another loud, bright laugh, completely pure and entirely safe from the toxicity of the men who came before him. I smiled, letting the warmth of the sun and the sound of my son's laughter fill the empty spaces in my heart. I had won the war. The past was dead, and the future was completely mine. The golden light of the late afternoon settled over the backyard, wrapping us in an unbreakable, quiet sanctuary as the world outside faded into black. The greatest lesson from these betrayals is that your worth is never defined by a toxic family's inability to see your value. True power isn't loud, it is built silently through resilience, financial independence, and unwavering self-belief. When you stop seeking validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding you, you finally reclaim your destiny. Blood may make you relatives, but strong boundaries and mutual respect are what truly make a family. You are the sole architect of your success. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering journeys.